The morning Ilara vanished began with a silence so unnatural that even the servants paused in their sweeping, as though the corridors themselves held their breath. In the winter gloom of Aylesford Manor, a single unopened letter lay upon the Duchess's escritoire, its sealing wax marked not by a lover's crest, as rumour would later suggest, but by the Duke's own monogram, never delivered into her hands. By noon that day, grooms were searching the stables, footmen were dispatched towards the frozen riverbank, and the Duchess's maid, usually incapable of quiet, had disappeared as thoroughly as her mistress. By dusk, speculation bled through London's drawing-rooms like ink through muslin, staining every conversation with suggestion and scandal. Society, ever eager for sensation, surrendered itself to the narrative offered so smoothly by Lady Aurelia. The young Duchess, restless and fragile, had eloped in disgrace with a nameless servant. It was a story so perfectly wicked that people clung to it with the satisfaction of being proven right about beauty that seemed too gentle for the responsibilities of rank. And though the Duke of Aylesford would neither confirm nor deny the rumour, his impassive silence was interpreted as quiet humiliation, sealing the tale as truth. Yet behind the manor's frost-coated windows, the truth was a very different portrait. The Duke's anguish was disciplined, buried beneath the rigid propriety expected of a man whose composure had been praised since boyhood. He had married Ilara not from a desperation for heirs but from a tenderness he never articulated, a tenderness that astonished him each time she smiled at him without calculation. She was young, yes, but she carried a sincerity that made even the grandest rooms feel less adorned. And now she was gone, absorbed by a darkness he could not penetrate, a mystery made crueler by the malicious certainty of those who believed she had chosen to wound him. He spent that first winter in a restless ritual, pacing the manor's west wing where her belongings remained undisturbed. Her embroidery frame still held a half-finished spray of lavender, the thread caught mid-stitch as though she intended to return within the hour. Her shawl, pale blue, trimmed with delicate knots she tied herself, remained draped across the back of a music chair she favored during evenings when she coaxed soft melodies from the pianoforte. The Duke would stand in the doorway, hands clasped behind him, staring at these remnants with the stillness of a man contemplating a battlefield after defeat. He commissioned investigators, quietly and at great expense, sending them across London, through Warwickshire, and into seaports where women vanished as easily as breath in winter. None returned with answers. Some brought fabricated sightings. Others confessed the trail had evaporated entirely after the night she disappeared. The Duchess had not run away with a footman, nor boarded any coach under her name, nor sought refuge in the homes of friends. It was as though the earth had closed over her without leaving a trace. By the time 6 years had passed, the world had settled into its verdict. The Duchess was a cautionary tale of feminine caprice, and the Duke a stoic victim of matrimonial folly. He allowed society to think him resigned, even indifferent. In truth, his mourning had merely grown silent, condensing into a habit of solitude. He rode often across his estates, as though movement itself could banish memory, yet every turning path reminded him of her laughter, of the way she once lifted her face to the wind as though England's fields belonged entirely to her delight. It was on such a ride, on a spring morning warmed by the scents of trampled clover and distant hearth smoke, that he entered the Warwickshire market fair. He had come only to inspect tenant improvements, but the fair, bright with ribbons and banners, pulled at the edges of his attention. Children darted between stalls, tradesmen bellowed their offers, women bartered, flirted, and argued with theatrical impatience. The Duke felt conspicuously out of place among such unrefined exuberance, yet he remained, compelled by an impulse he could not explain. Then came the chime of harness bells, rhythmic, metallic, almost musical, and the crowd parted to reveal a Romani caravan rolling slowly along the main road. The wagons were painted in colors more vivid than anything seen in Aylesford's galleries. Crimson swirls, sapphire motifs, arches of gold leaf glinting beneath the sun. Fabrics fluttered from the sides like captured fragments of distant countries. The Duke watched with detached interest until a movement behind a tattered curtain froze him where he stood. A pale hand lifted the fabric. A thin wrist. A gown torn and faded, its stitching unmistakably fine despite its ruin. And upon the hand, a ring he knew as intimately as his own pulse, a ring he had placed upon Ilara's finger the night they wed, engraved with the motto of his house and the date he once believed would mark the beginning of a lifetime. The woman's face appeared behind the curtain. She was gaunt, her features shadowed by weariness, yet the structure of her cheekbones, the gentle curve of her lips, the luminous pallor of her eyes, These struck him with the force of a memory so sharp it seemed to cut through time. She stared at him not with joy or recognition, but with a startled confusion, like one seeing a ghost rumored but never expected. He stepped forward instinctively, calling her name, a name that seemed to tremble in the air rather than echo. The woman flinched. A man stepped between them, dark-haired and broad-shouldered, his posture protective, almost defiant. He spoke in a dialect the Duke did not understand, urging the horses onward. The wagon lurched, wheels groaning, curtain falling shut with a finality that stole the breath from the Duke's lungs. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring muttered objections, his gaze fixed on the retreating caravan. 1,000 questions collided in his mind. How she had survived, why she had not returned, what horrors lay behind the emptiness in her eyes, but none held sufficient clarity to slow his pursuit. For the first time in 6 years, purpose surged through him with feverish heat. Yet even as he mounted his horse to follow, a fear settled cold within his chest. The woman he had seen looked like Alara, moved like Alara, and wore the ring he had once kissed upon her hand, but she had gazed at him as though she had never known him at all. And with that fear came a deeper dread, a premonition that whatever truth awaited him would not restore the past he mourned, but unravel it entirely. The Duke's pursuit began before the caravan had vanished beyond the hedgerows, for the shock of seeing Alara's face, wan, bewildered, and unbearably familiar, ignited a resolve that cut through 6 years of disciplined grief. He urged his horse forward, following the painted wagons as they wound toward the outskirts of the fairground. The spring air, fragrant with earth and crushed blossoms, seemed charged with an urgency that matched the tempo of his heartbeat. Every turn of the road intensified his conviction that he had not been deceived by longing, that the woman he saw was not a phantom conjured by memory but his wife, altered by suffering yet unmistakably alive. When he reached the caravan's encampment, a half-circle of wagons stood arranged like a shield against the world. Smoke curled from a central fire, carrying the scent of burning cedar. Children darted among the wheels, halting at the sight of the Duke, whose presence carried the weight of authority even stripped of attendants. A few women glanced up, their expressions cautious but not unfriendly. It was the tall, broad-shouldered man from the wagon, now stepping forward with deliberate calm, who held the Duke's attention. The Duke dismounted, his voice firm but not raised. He demanded to see the woman from the fair. The man answered with a guarded courtesy, introducing himself as Toma Larkov. His eyes, dark as polished obsidian, betrayed neither hostility nor submission. He was simply a man accustomed to protecting what was his. When the Duke insisted that the woman was his wife, Toma's expression hardened. He stated quietly that she belonged to no one, that she had been found years ago, half dead in a thicket outside Shropshire, and that she remembered nothing of her name, her origin, or the event that had nearly taken her life. The Duke felt the ground tilt beneath him at this simple, devastating declaration. He demanded proof of her claimed amnesia, though he scarcely knew what proof might satisfy him. Toma did not react to the severity of his tone. Instead, he motioned for one of the women to fetch the pale figure from the wagon. When Alara emerged, wrapped in a shawl of dull plum, she moved with the tentative grace of someone unaccustomed to being observed. Her eyes met the Duke's briefly before flickering away, as though the strength required to hold his gaze exceeded what she possessed. The Duke stepped forward with a tenderness he could not disguise, addressing her by name. The slight tremor in her posture suggested the name stirred something faint and troubling, yet not enough to anchor her. She touched the ring on her finger, as though aware it meant something important, but she recoiled when he attempted to take her hand. Toma intervened, placing himself between them with a composure that belied the gesture's firmness. He explained that the woman, whom they called Mira, experienced distress when pressed about her past. Whatever life she had once lived, it had been washed away by trauma and fever. To force recollection might only wound her further. The Duke listened with strained restraint. The notion that she had lived these years without recognition, comforted only by strangers, gnawed at him with a bitterness he struggled to contain. Yet he could not deny that Toma's care for her appeared genuine. She leaned slightly toward the Romani leader, as a frightened fawn might lean toward a gentle hand, though her glance at the Duke held an ache he could not interpret. He asked how she had come to possess the ring. Toma answered by withdrawing a small scrap of silk from his pocket, its fabric once fine but now frayed. He said it had been tied around her wrist when they found her. The ring had been on her finger then. The Duke took the fragment, recognizing at once the embroidery Alara had stitched during their first year of marriage. The delicate pattern, though stained and torn, struck him with the force of a confession. His wife had not fled him. She had been taken, or harmed, and left to die. News of the encounter did not remain contained for long. Some tenant farmers had witnessed his pursuit and, sensing scandal, carried word toward neighboring estates. By evening, the gossip had begun its slow crawl toward London, where it would surely ignite society's voracious appetite for whispers. The Duchess, long believed a runaway, had been discovered living among Romani wanderers. What had once been scandal would now transform into a fresh storm of speculation, fueled by those eager to dissect the Duke's dignity and the Duchess's presumed degradation. Lady Aurelia, upon learning of the rumor, showed no outward alarm. She dismissed the tale as fantasy, insisting that the Duke had been misled by a charlatan seeking coin. But beneath her composure flickered the faintest note of unease, perceptible only to those who knew how to read the subtle movements of her gloved hands. She had spent years cultivating the belief that Alara had destroyed herself. The return of the Duchess threatened to undo a narrative she had woven with strategic precision. The Duke, however, refused to allow society to claim his wife a second time. He commanded his steward to keep the matter discreet, though he understood such discretion would be fleeting. What mattered now was ensuring her safety and uncovering the truth that had eluded him for 6 long years. He returned to the encampment at dusk, when the caravan's fires glowed like scattered jewels beneath the deepening sky. Toma did not deny him entry. He seemed to recognize that the Duke's urgency carried not the arrogance of nobility, but the desperation of a man rediscovering the center of his world. The Romani leader allowed him one final conversation with Alara before they departed at sunrise. She sat by the fire, its flames illuminating her face in shifting gold and shadow. The Duke approached her slowly, mindful of the fragility she carried like a second skin. He asked whether she remembered anything, any glimmer of her former life. She spoke softly, her voice like a thread unraveling in the dark. She remembered music, she said, though not the source. She remembered rain striking a stone path. She remembered lifting her hands toward someone whose face she could not see. These fragments, mere shards of a shattered mirror, pierced the Duke more deeply than any absence could. They were proof that she had once lived fully, vividly, lovingly, and that those stolen memories might yet return. As she spoke, she hummed a faint melody under her breath, unaware of its significance. The Duke recognized it instantly, a tune he had composed for her on an autumn evening when she was first learning the pianoforte. The realization struck him with a quiet, searing joy. Something within her remembered him, even if she did not know why. The caravan would remain only 3 days, Toma explained, after which they must continue their journey. The Duke nodded, though the enormity of the time constraint left him breathless. He stared into the fire, listening to its soft hiss, feeling the weight of nearing revelation and the tremor of possibilities long buried. As he mounted his horse to depart, Alara looked up, her expression uncertain yet searching, as though stirred by an instinct older than memory itself. That fleeting glance settled into him with the force of a vow. Whatever truth awaited them, he would not lose her again. Toma's agreement to entrust Alara to the Duke's care did not come easily. It was granted only after a private conversation beside the dying embers of the caravan's fire, where the Duke spoke not as a nobleman accustomed to obedience, but as a man stripped to his longing. Toma studied him with the grave perceptiveness of one who had seen too many lives broken by forces beyond their control. At last, he said that Mira Alara deserved the chance to reclaim whatever had been stolen from her, and that the Duke would be the one held accountable should she come to harm. With that vow, the transfer of her fragile trust began, though she stepped toward the Duke with the hesitance of someone walking through a half-remembered dream. Their journey to Aylesford Manor unfolded in a silence punctuated only by the creaking of the carriage and the occasional breath she drew as though the very air confounded her. The Duke watched her from across the dim interior, careful not to overwhelm her with direct scrutiny. Her hands remained clasped in her lap, fingers worrying the ring that bound past to present. She seemed both drawn toward him and recoiled by the weight of recognition she could not yet summon. Each time their eyes met, a flicker of something trembled there. Fear, curiosity, perhaps a faint echo of the affection they once shared, but it vanished too quickly to grasp. When the carriage approached the manor, she gazed at the towering facade with a puzzlement that bordered on dread. The stone walls, adorned with climbing ivy, might once have represented sanctuary or joy. Now they loomed like the half-familiar outline of a forgotten story. The Duke helped her step down, offering his arm with a courtesy softened by emotion. She accepted it only because declining seemed too strenuous a decision. Servants gathered discreetly, their expressions oscillating between astonishment and superstition. The Duchess had returned, but not as the radiant figure they remembered. Inside the manor, the air held the scent of lavender polish and distant hearth smoke. Ilara walked cautiously, pausing to touch the balustrade as though confirming its solidity. Her gaze wandered across portraits lining the corridor. When she halted before one depicting a young woman in a pale gown, her breath wavered. The Duke joined her, heart hammering with a hope he restrained. The portrait was hers, painted in their second year of marriage, capturing her serene smile and luminous eyes. But she stared at it as though witnessing a stranger's beauty, unable to claim even a fragment of it as her own. A surge of despair swept through the Duke, followed by determination. He led her to a guest chamber prepared carefully, for he dared not force her into the room that had been hers. Its furnishings were gentle, the colors soft, the windows overlooking the gardens she once adored. She traced a fingertip along the embroidered coverlet, then turned to him with an expression both open and cautious, as if asking silently whether she might remain untethered by expectation. He assured her she was not a prisoner, nor an exhibit to be displayed. She was a guest, free to move, free to question, free to choose. She nodded, uncertain yet soothed by the deliberate restraint in his voice. Over the next hours, physicians came to evaluate her, their questions probing yet respectful. They confirmed signs of long-healed injuries, bruising patterns and scar tissue consistent with violence rather than accident. The Duke's jaw tightened as he listened. Their conclusion stirred a storm within him. Ilara had not vanished by whim but by force. Someone had attempted to end her life. And that someone had gone undetected under his own roof. Guilt clung to him like frost, chilling every breath. Ilara heard enough to understand her past had been darkened by malevolence, though the source remained lost to her. She retreated to the quiet of the manor's library as evening approached. The vast room, lit by the glow of a single fire, felt safer than the echoing corridors. She stood before the shelves, trailing her fingers along leather spines, pausing occasionally as though encountering sensations carved into her bones. The Duke found her there, his approach cautious. The firelight softened his features, revealing the exhaustion etched into them by years of mourning. "Are you overwhelmed?" he asked gently. She considered the question. "I feel displaced, as though I am inhabiting someone else's life." "That life was yours," he replied, though his tone carried no insistence. "But I understand that its return cannot be forced." She turned toward him slowly. The fire-painted copper glints in her hair, revealing its diminished luster. "Why do you look at me with such sorrow?" The simplicity of the question struck him deeply. "Because I failed to protect you," he said, the words escaping before he could temper them. Her brow furrowed. "You speak as if I belonged to you." "You were my wife," he answered. "Not by confinement, but by devotion. You were cherished, Ilara, and you were lost to me." His confession hung between them, fragile and immense. She studied his face, absorbing the sincerity in his voice, the ache buried beneath his composure. Yet her own emptiness bewildered her. She felt the pull of his grief, not its origin. Stepping closer, she spoke with quiet uncertainty. "I do not recall the woman you describe. I do not recall loving you." The Duke bowed his head slightly, accepting the blow without protest. "Then we must begin from what you do recall." Her gaze drifted to the window where rain had begun to streak the glass, each droplet sliding downward like a memory struggling to take form. "I remember this sound," she murmured. "Rain upon stone. It frightened me that night, the night in my dream." He lifted his head sharply. "What dream?" She pressed a hand to her temple as though steadying a wavering image. Voices. A fall. Water rising. And a woman's whisper, cold, triumphant. "I do not know what it means." The Duke closed his eyes briefly, not from disbelief but recognition. Something in her fragmented recollection aligned with fears he had nursed in silence for years. He forced calm into his voice. "These dreams may be more than visions. They may be your memory stirring." She exhaled shakily, stepping back as though frightened by her own mind. "If the past is as violent as the doctor suggests, I am not certain I wish to reclaim it." He followed her retreat by only a step, allowing space yet refusing abandonment. "Memory does not always return with pain," he said. "Sometimes it arrives with truth. And truth, Ilara, may yet free you." Her eyes found his, and for the first time, she did not look away. Something warm flickered there, a sense of safety born not from recognition but from the gentleness he offered without demand. She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand before withdrawing quickly, startled by her own impulse. He held still, honoring the moment with silence. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, a somber drum roll echoing through the manor. She lifted her head, listening with an expression caught between dread and revelation. "Adrian," she whispered, tasting the name as though it had risen from the deepest chamber of her being. The Duke inhaled sharply. It was the first time she had spoken his name since her return. Rain intensified, striking the windows with a fury not unlike the hearts stirring within the library. And though she did not yet remember their love, the sound of his name on her lips marked the first true fracture in the wall obscuring her past. Dawn had scarcely broken when the household stirred with a tension that seemed to crackle through the corridors, for Ilara had woken with clarity in her gaze rather than confusion. The Duke sensed at once that something within her had shifted, as though the threads of memory had tightened into a pattern she could finally name. She asked to see the gardens, not out of idle curiosity but with the focused intent of a woman seeking proof of her own recollections. As they stepped into the cool morning air, she paused beneath the archway of climbing roses, her breath catching as a burst of recognition seemed to flare behind her eyes. She touched a fallen petal, murmuring that she once braided such blossoms into garlands during summer fetes, a detail so precise it banished all doubt from the Duke's heart. His hope, long suppressed by grief and guilt, rose with trembling force, yet he restrained his elation, fearing pressure might shatter the delicate return of her identity. But Ilara did not retreat. Instead she walked toward the ornamental pool, where water mirrored the sky with a stillness that unnerved her. She stared into its depths, recalling the dream of her fall, then whispered that the stone steps in her vision resembled those of the manor's western terrace, a detail the Duke had long feared was true. Without prompting, she turned and moved swiftly toward the terrace, her steps accelerating as instinct overrode caution. At the landing, she pressed her hand to the railing, her eyes widening as memory surged with a force that bent her posture. She remembered the shove, the flash of triumph, and the voice dripping satisfaction as darkness swallowed her. When she spoke the name, Aurelia, it carried no hesitation, only the tremor of betrayal newly unearthed. The Duke felt his world tilt as every suspicion he had buried beneath propriety crystallized into certainty. His stepmother's poised cruelty, her eagerness to propagate Ilara's disgrace, her relentless counsel to abandon the search, each fragment aligned into a truth he could no longer deny. Ilara's knees threatened to give way, but the Duke caught her with a gentleness that steadied them both. She trembled, not from weakness but from the sharp resurgence of identity, as though reclaiming herself required a battle against the shadows that had obscured her. She clung to his sleeve, whispering that she now remembered loving him, though the emotion felt fragile and newly awakened. The Duke did not press her for more. Instead he guided her indoors, summoning only those servants whose loyalty had weathered the years. Together they prepared an inquiry with solemn precision, gathering witness accounts, examining the ledger Aurelia kept with obsessive secrecy, and identifying the maid whose disappearance coincided suspiciously with Ilara's fall. Every discovery tightened the noose around the truth. When Aurelia entered the drawing room that evening, she found not the obedient stepson she had cultivated but a man transformed by righteous fury. Ilara stood beside him, pale yet resolute, her presence a silent accusation more devastating than any spoken charge. Aurelia's eyes flickered with calculation, yet for the first time she appeared unsure of her footing. The Duke presented the ledger, the affidavits, the recollected fragments of Ilara's memory, and the testimony of a footman who admitted he had been paid to spread the tale of her elopement. Aurelia's mask cracked. She attempted indignation, then persuasion, then wounded innocence, but the evidence was a tide too powerful for her practiced deceptions to withstand. When confronted with Alara's description of the fall, Aurelia's composure fractured entirely. Her confession was not shouted but exhaled, a hiss of envy and entitlement, revealing a resentment sharpened over years by the knowledge that the duchy's affection had settled irrevocably on Alara. The Duke dismissed her coldly, ensuring she would face the consequences without the shield of her former influence. In the days that followed, Alara moved through the manor with growing assurance, no longer a ghost drifting through borrowed spaces but a woman reclaiming the foundations of her life. Each rediscovered detail, a familiar corridor, a locket stored in a drawer, a melody echoing faintly from the pianoforte, stitched her identity back together with threads both painful and precious. Yet even as her memory strengthened, she remained wary of reclaiming her title. The years spent with the caravan had taught her a gentler freedom, one shaped by loyalty rather than hierarchy. She confessed to the Duke that she feared losing the woman she had become, even as she longed to honor the woman she had once been. The Duke listened without attempting to guide her choice, though his heart tightened with each vulnerable admission. He told her he wished not to reclaim the past but to build a future shaped by truth rather than shadows. His restraint, his willingness to let her define her own destiny, became the anchor that steadied her wavering certainty. Word of Aurelia's downfall spread quickly through the county, yet the Duke shielded Alara from society's voracious gaze. Invitations were declined, curious callers were turned away. Alara spent her days recovering strength and rediscovering quiet joys, while the Duke maintained a vigilant distance, offering companionship without intrusion, as though aware her heart required room to breathe. One evening, as twilight slipped into the hush of night, she sought him in the manor chapel, where candles flickered against stone walls worn by generations of devotion. He knelt not in supplication but in contemplation, his posture that of a man weighing hope against restraint. She approached quietly, her footsteps echoing like an unspoken question. He rose as she neared, his expression open yet uncertain, as though fearing the fragile equilibrium between them might fracture. Alara touched the wooden pew beside her, steadying herself before speaking. She told him she wished to reclaim her place not because duty demanded it but because her heart, at last, remembered the sanctuary it had once found in him. The Duke stepped closer, though not so near as to overwhelm her, and offered his hand with a reverence that made her breath catch. He vowed to honor both the woman she had been and the woman she had become, promising a partnership not forged by obligation but renewed by choice. Her fingers intertwined with his, steady and sure. At dawn the next day, they walked the grounds together, the air bright with the quiet promise of beginnings reclaimed. Alara lifted her face to the light, feeling not expectation but the warmth of a future she chose freely, moving forward hand in hand with the man who never surrendered hope at last.